As is customary in Australia before an event, I would like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which those of us living in the Greater Caulfield area of Melbourne reside. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. I'm so excited to have these three incredible guests on our panel. Award-winning journalist and author Matty Friedman was born in Toronto. In 1995, he immigrated to Israel. Between 2006-2011, Matty was a correspondent for the Associated Press and reported from Egypt, Morocco, Lebanon, Moscow, and Washington. He's currently a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, covering Israeli politics and culture. He is the author of 3 award-winning books, Aleppo Codex, Pumpkin Flowers, and Spies of No Country. Each of his books have won numerous awards. His most recent award was in 2020, when he won the Vine Awards for his latest book, the book we are about to discuss. The Vine Awards honors the best Canadian literature by Jewish writers or on Jewish subjects. Spies of No Country give us a true and accurate insight into the lives of 4 men who were part of a spy unit called the Arab Section. This unit consisted of Jews who were native to the Arab world and could thus easily, or maybe not so easily, assume Arab identities. Jacob Shoshan was born in Israel and is the son of the late Isaac Shoshan, one of the first spies of Israel that formed the basis of this incredible story. Jacob has been an educator and guide for March of the Living since 2005. Besides being an educator on March of the Living, Jacob is a brilliant private tour guide. He has traveled to 106 countries and speaks 15 languages fluently. He has guided tours in 67 of these countries. I met Jacob when he was one of my educators on March of the Living in 2013, and since then have kept up a wonderful friendship with him. He is the most incredible storyteller with a terrific sense of humor and a huge personality. I'm sure that those that have been fortunate enough to have Jacob as their guide will agree with all my sentiments. Frances Prince, our moderator, lives in Melbourne and during normal non-COVID times, also partly in Jerusalem. She has spent her career in Jewish education and has been deeply immersed in Holocaust education. In our community, she wears so many hats, including being one of the co-founders of March of the Living, Australia. Frances sits on the committee of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, holding the multicultural and interfaith portfolio, and represents the Jewish community on a number of interfaith boards. In 2019, she was central in organizing a most successful trip to Israel for 12 women, 4 Jewish, 4 Christian, and 4 Muslims. It was called the Joint Journey to Jerusalem, under the auspices of the Jewish Christian Muslim Association. Frances is also about to publish her own book in August, and we are so looking forward to receiving her very first copy. Thank you to Lauren Jaffe, the director of the Lamb Library, Hannah Yohalam for designing that incredible flyer, and to Joey Wilkinson for managing this event. Without your endless hours of input, this event would not be taking place. Welcome and thank you to all of you. If there are any questions during this talk, please feel free to ask them under the chat section, and we will have a question and answers towards the end of this event. Thank you.
And thank you, Ilana, for that gracious introduction. On behalf of all of us, no matter where members of the audience are or what time it is, wherever you are, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Matti Friedman and Jacob Shoshan. Before we actually get into our actual discussion, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the fact that this event is being held in memory of and in honor of Jacob's late father, Isaac Shoshan. Even though you'll be sort of looking at the 3 of us on the screen in front of you, I actually feel that Isaac is also going to be a central person, or a sort of a hovering presence, if you like, in our conversation. Would there have been a book for Matty to write without Isaac? I can ask him directly, But I would guess that probably, yes, there would be a book here, but whether it would be such a personal and evocative book without Isaac Shoshan's input, I'm not so sure. Isaac passed away at the age of 96 on the 28th of December, 2020, very recently. We express our condolences to you, Jacob, and your family, and dedicate our event to a hero of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, your father, Isaac Shoshan, Zichrono Livracha. May his memory be for a blessing. With this event, there's a bit of a fine balancing act that's going to happen. We've got Matty, the reporter, journalist, and author, and we have Jacob, the son of one of the protagonists, Isaac, who was Matty's main living source in his research of this topic. So I feel on the one hand, we are going to discuss Matty's book, but on the other hand, I feel that Isaac will sort of be walking out of the pages of the book into real life, as it were, as Jacob's father. I'm going to start with Matty, the author of Spies of No Country, with the subtitle being Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. And I can see there's also an edition where the secondary title is Israel's Secret Agents at the Birth of the Mossad. I want to start with Matty. After all, this is a Lamb Jewish Library event, so I feel it's most suitable that we start with a book. Matty, you have taken a huge, multifaceted story of the founding of the State of Israel, and you've narrowed down the parameters. You focus on a specific time, January 1948 to August 1949, and in case anyone's forgot, the 14th of May 1948 was the declaration of the state. You come down to two specific places, mainly, pre-independence Haifa, and then Beirut, Lebanon. And there are four specific people in the book. There are others, perhaps more on the margins, if you like. We have Gamliel, we have Yakuba, we have Habakkuk, and we have Isaac, being Isaac Shoshan, Jacob's father. And you take this and you shape for us a gobsmacking story that I hope will gain its proper, deserving place in the annals of the founding of the State of Israel. Now, I don't want to take responsibility for, giving too much away for spoilers. So I'm going to ask you, Matty, can you please give us a brief overview of the book, Spies of No Country? But as you're doing so, can you please talk to us about the genesis of the writing and the motivation behind this topic?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me at this event. I'm sorry that we can't do it in person, and I hope we will be able to at some point in the not too distant future. And it's great to be here with Jacob. The book actually, in response to your theoretical question about whether the book could or could not have been written without Isaac, the answer is actually no. The book would never have been written if I hadn't happened to meet Isaac, Isaac Shoshan, in 2011. I was working on a completely different book called the Aleppo Codex, which is about an ancient copy of the Bible. And one of my main sources for that book was an elderly ex-Mossad agent who told me that I had to meet a friend of his, an even older ex-Mossad agent. And I didn't know exactly why I was being sent to meet Isaac Shoshan, but I've learned over many years as a journalist that if someone offers to introduce you to an old spy, just go. You won't regret it. It's never a waste of time. So I went from my home in Jerusalem down to Bat Yam, which is kind of a sweaty suburb of Tel Aviv, and had a fascinating conversation with Isaac Shoshan that ended up changing the way I see the country. He told me a story about the founding of the state that I had never heard before, and it was about people whose names I had never heard in a unit that I had never heard of called the Arab Section. And it took me many years until I understood the importance of the story, until I could really flesh it out. Many, many conversations with Isaac. I went back again and again to sit with him in his apartment in Bat Yam, in this small kitchen with green tiles on the wall, and he would kind of walk very slowly over from his little table and make me black coffee and a finjan, which is like a tin pot with a long handle like they used to make black coffee in the days of the Palmach, which is the pre-state militia that he was part of. And he would brew me coffee and we'd sit and he told me stories and he told me more stories and gave me more names. And I managed to get documents that I could use to cross-check the stories that Isaac was telling me. I met other people who were tendentially involved. I found documents that had been left behind by some of the other characters, none of whom unfortunately were alive by the time I delved into the story. And all of that came together over a period of many, many years to become this book, Spies of No Country, which came out, I guess, eight years after my first conversation with Yitzchak. And one of the proudest moments of my journalistic career, I think, was traveling to Bat Yam to give Isaac a copy of the book. Isaac was very elderly. He was in his 90s, and I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get this done in time. And I had the what they call an advance copy of the book. It's a kind of a paperback copy that goes out to reviewers, but it had a picture of Isaac on the cover. And I went to Bat Yam and I gave him a copy of the book, and he saw himself on the cover. And I think he realized that a story that should have been told long before had ultimately been put down on paper, and I think it made him happy. And of course, that made me very happy.
Thank you for that, Matty. I'm just going to say, I'm not Matty's agent, okay? So there's nothing in this for me. But, I would like people to actually go and buy the book, to be intrigued by tonight. And please don't think at the end of it, oh, you've heard enough, you know the story. You don't, okay? So really, I'm going to plug, please actually go and buy it. What you don't know, Matty, is that I was actually in Jerusalem at the launching of this book. In April 2019, I was at Bet Avichai when the Times of Israel was hosting. So I heard you talk, and for those who know me on who are watching, this will make sense. I ran down the back stairs, and I actually was the first in line for you to sign it. So I have to say, this night or the day, wherever you are, intrigues people and piques people's interest to rush out and and buy it. You mightn't be able to get it signed, but I did. Okay, let me now please turn to Jacob. I guess my first question to you, Jacob, is, growing up, did you know that your father was a spy, let alone one of Israel's first spies? In fact, Isaac was an Israeli spy before there was an Israel. Jacob, how was it? What did you know?
Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. What does your father do? He works for the government. He works for the army. He works for the Ministry of Defense. And that was it. He would then travel sometimes. He says, well, tomorrow I might not be able to see you. I have to go away for some days. And where did you go? Oh, I had some things to take care of, but we never knew anything. Only when we grew up, we started hearing, because it was being published, about his time in Lebanon, about some of the activities of that Arab section in the years leading to statehood. They are beautifully described by Matti in the book, whether it was the car bomb in Haifa or dealing with some of the leading members of the Arab resistance and some of the who instigated some horror activities against the Jews. So these were published, these were written up, whether it was in the Palmach publication, some newspaper clips, and the stories that his friends would tell, and reminiscence when they would meet, they would have some gatherings, but never found the full extent of what he did, and probably never will. Some of the things that he did will probably never will. Definitely not in our lifetime will they be published. But we did realize later on that here we have somebody who did some marvelous things. In addition, which is most important for me, to have had the best father one can aspire, loving and caring and nurturing, kind and accepting and accommodating in every possible way. Unfortunately, my mother was not well. So in addition to working hard and doing whatever he did, he had to take care of a wife who was not well, and she passed away when she was 42 after many years of being bedridden. So he was a father and a mother to us. And then in the middle of everything, he thought he should go and complete his education. So he went to, in addition to everything, to dedicate a lot of time to study, to graduate, and so on. So that's the most important thing embedded in me. The rest is in the background. Yes, a wonderful person, the great things that he did. But for us, my sister and myself, first and foremost, the most incredible parent.
It's heartwarming, really heartwarming. I think, like, you know, when you talk about the balance between your home life and your work life, when you talk about being a spy like Isaac, it's the question becomes a much bigger question. Okay, it's very sort of interesting, and we'll talk more about you growing up soon. Matty, I want to ask you, and I guess Jacob already said something about, you know, not knowing everything. I was wondering, Matty, since you spent so much time, so many hours with Isaac, I could see the finjan going coffee after coffee. Do you think that Isaac shared with you some information that he perhaps did not share with his family? I mean, you mightn't have included this in the book, those details, but do you think he may have spilt some of those proverbial beans that he hasn't to anyone else?
That's a good question. I guess Jacob could probably tell us if he was surprised by anything in the book. I was kind of amazed by how clear his memory was, and how, because we're talking about events that happened 60, 70 years before I conducted the interviews, everything that I could check with other sources turned out to be rock solid. So we had a kind of a crystal clear memory, and he was also, if you've ever covered spies or written stories about great military exploits, you often find that there's a lot of bluster. A lot of people inflate their own actions, and there's a lot of hot air that you have to wade through as a journalist before you get to the facts. And Isaac was very unique in that none of that was true of him. He would, if anything, make himself sound smaller, and he was incredibly modest, and he made no great claims for himself and no great claims of having single-handedly founded the state of Israel or saved the Jewish people. He put himself on the side in many cases and gave the center stage to other characters. He was quite amazing in that way. Whether he told me anything secret, I'm not sure. I definitely heard stories from him that had never been published anywhere else, and it definitely led me to stories in the archives that might have come out in very simplified versions but hadn't really been fleshed out. The story of the Arab section, unfortunately, it's not that it was secret until now, but it was barely known. Inside the intelligence community, people know it, and of course anyone who was personally connected to the section knew the Arab section, Hamachlaka Ha'aravi, that's what it's called in Hebrew, but the general public in Israel, and of course the Jewish reading public outside of Israel had really never heard this story, although it is, in my opinion, one of the great stories of the founding of the state, and a story that's much more useful to understanding today's Israel than many of the other stories that we tell about 1948. So whether it's secret or not, I'm glad that the story's out there and being discussed. It's a bit late, but better late than never.
Okay, thank you, Matty. Jacob, after the Arab section closed down, your father continued his career in this sort of secretive field. Can you tell us, I'm not asking what you knew at the time, but how did his career then open up after the Arab section?
So actually, he became part, even though he never was drafted officially, into the Israeli army while being abroad. So when he came back, it was just a matter of formalities to make him a soldier, and right away he was engaged in an officer academy to become an officer, and then he went to special training as an intelligence and reconnaissance officer, and right away he started working, operating some informants across the border and gathering more information and more facts and figures and people, information about people across the border. And he did that for a number of years. At one point, it was a realization that you cannot always trust these informants. They were mostly for the money. They were Arabs. Some of them were unhappy with whoever, so they said, okay, that's a chance to, retaliate or whatever. But mostly they were there, let's admit it, for the money, and sometimes they betrayed their operators, and some people were killed by those informants, which led the people, the powers that be in that case, to decide, well, we might not be able to count entirely on them. Let's go back to the concept of the Arab section. Let's train our people to pretend to be who they are not and send our people whom we can trust much better to gather that information or perform whatever activities they had to do. And that has led to the foundation of that incredible unit, which still is an incredible shining star in our military, our security life, which is the Sayeret Matkal, the very special hit squad. And his part was preparing them to act like Arabs, not only to speak the language, but to practice, whether it's for prayer services or even small gestures. In your civilization, somebody will ask, kindly, politely, how many children do you have? If you're an Arab, you'll never do that without putting your hand on your belly. If you don't do that, immediately somebody will know that something is wrong with you. I'm just showing a tiny little example, a detail that if you don't think about it, okay, so who cares? They didn't put their hand. The other party might discover you. And that's what he did for a number of years, training these people with the language, with the religion, with the courtesies, with the pleasantries. It's not just say, hi, how are you? There is a whole set of pleasantries that had to be said, or responses, giving thanks, appreciate, complimenting, whether it's the cup of coffee, as Matti mentioned, or some other things that you have to respond. And then he went to work for the Mossad. So actually, from his youth until his retirement, and as we found out only later, past his retirement, he continued being involved in the country's securities issues.
Thank you for that, Jacob. And I actually want to take what you've said and throw this to Matti. I particularly enjoyed in the book your explanation or your discussion about multiple identities. What you say, wearing different skins. I mean, who were these spies? I'm going back to the original, to the Arab section, to those days. I mean, who were they to others is what Jacob is talking about. And, the subtleties and the nuances, you do something that a Jew, that an Arab, in Tripoli might do, and it's not what, someone from, I don't know, Cairo would do. And, that's the dangerous game, obviously. That ain't no game. I get that. But what I want to focus on now is sort of who were they to themselves? And that's the question I'd like to explore. I mean, originally they came from Arab countries. They came on Aliyah, immigration to really what was Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, not Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, because the state of Israel didn't quite exist yet. And then they collide with Jews from, Ashkenazi, European origin, and they more or less try to fit into the society while being looked down upon, and we'll deal with that a bit later. And then they're sort of plucked out of that world of trying to belong purely and simply due to their original identities, but there's a twist. What is being valued is their Arabness. That is what's being valued here, and they get plucked out and they get sent. It's not necessarily sent back to the community they came from. And I want to go back to what, again, use Jacobs, is that, they were called Hamist Arabim, ones who become like Arabs. So I'd like Matty to speak about that, but I want to make one little thing, and I can't avoid it because of the world we live in. Those of us who are Fauda fans, and I'm sure everyone here loves watching Fauda, and they use the term Hamista Rabin. But I'm very aware, and I guess I just want to point that out, the word or concept is used very differently. When we watch Fauda and I sit in my lounge room and I'm at the edge of my seat and I can barely watch, I mean, they dip in and out. They're in, they're out, they're back, they're forward, you never see them again, they're back, and so on. When we talk about Hamista Aravim, Isaac and his colleagues, they're in it for the long haul. They are embedded in Arabic societies. So what skins, multiple skins, are they wearing?
That's I think the question at the heart of the book. That's really what interested me about this story, because we have a lot of stories about Israeli spies, and in many cases, the guys from the Arab section later in life describe themselves as Israeli spies because that's what they became, including Isaac. But at the time of this story, they're not Israelis, as you point out. There is no state of Israel. When Isaac is sent on his mission into Lebanon, disguised as a Palestinian refugee, there is no state of Israel. This happens before the state of Israel is declared. Who are these people? They're trained in a tent on the outskirts of a kibbutz, and they're taught about Islam. They're taught to recite passages from the Quran. They're taught how to pray like Muslims, but they don't need to be taught Arabic because that's their native language. Isaac and the others came to Israel from Arab countries. Isaac was from Aleppo, and he came to Israel as a teenager. So his Arab identity wasn't fake. It wasn't acquired. He had a genuine Arab identity that had to be molded in certain ways. He had to become a Palestinian rather than a Syrian. He had to become a Muslim rather than a Jew, but he wasn't faking his Arabness. It was genuine in many ways. So you have these kids who show up on the kibbutzim in the 1940s, hoping to fit in. They wanted to be pioneers. They wanted to join the story of the national rebirth of the Jews, but they were too different from the people on the kibbutzim. The kibbutznikim were from Eastern Europe, or they were the native-born children of East Europeans. And these kids who'd come from Aleppo, who came from Yemen, they were too different. They seemed Arab. They seemed too similar to the enemy, and they couldn't shake that difference, and they tried. So Isaac is a great example. Isaac Shoshan isn't his first name. His first name, the one he grows up with, is Zaki Shasho. His family name is Shasho. It's a pretty well-known family name for Jews in Aleppo. He comes to the kibbutz. You can't be Zaki Shasho on the kibbutz. It sounds too different. So he Hebraicizes his name and calls himself Isaac Shoshan. And that doesn't quite work. He still can't break in. And the same is true of his friends from the unit. We have another friend whose name is Jamil Cohen. In 2021, it sounds funny to have a Jew named Jamil Cohen, but there used to be a lot of people with names like Jamil Cohen. He was from Damascus, and he changes his name. He starts using his Hebrew name, Gamliel Cohen. But they can't quite fit in. They're still too different. And they're trying, and they're playing this kind of complicated identity game where they're trying to be Sabras, they're trying to be pioneers, but they're too close to the Arab side for that really to work. And then at the end of the Second World War, as things heat up toward the founding of the state, a guy comes from the Palmach, this pre-state militia, and he's looking for these kids on the kibbutzim who can't fit in because they're too Arab. And he takes them, he kind of pulls them out of the kibbutz, and he says, okay, you're going to be allowed entry into the holy of holies of the Jewish national movement, which is this elite force called the Palmach. But the price is that you have to pretend to be the people you ran away from. You have to drop this whole Isaac Shoshan thing, and you have to go back to being not just Zaki Shasho. You're going to actually adopt a new identity, which in the case of Isaac was Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki. You're going to be a Palestinian Muslim. And that identity is going to be your weapon in the fight to found the state of Israel. And with these assumed or not quite assumed Arab identities, they're sent back into the Arab world to become Israel's first spies. And that's the complexity at the heart of this story. They're in Lebanon. They're pretending to be refugees, right? They're pretending to be Arab refugees from a Jewish country, when in fact they're Jewish refugees from an Arab country. They're actually refugees in many ways, and they're actually Arabs in many ways, and they're certainly Jews in many ways. And all of that complexity gets lost if you just call them Israeli spies. Something much more complicated is going on.
Thank you. And as you say, I agree with you, which is obviously why I asked the question. It is the heart of the book, identity. I'd like to ask you, Jacob, in growing up with your father, and someone there anyway.
Hello.
Okay. How did he influence your life? Like once you grew up with him and you're telling us about what a loving, attentive father he was under difficult circumstances. And you're also lucky to have had him in old age as well. So there's, his reflection and so on. So at this stage, I'll sort of ask the influence upon you. And do you think it influenced your life path? I mean, there's many.
Hello.
So some influences we know are, more subtle than others. But how were you your father's son?
That's a very interesting issue. On one hand, and many of you have known it, we do live in a society filled with, I shouldn't say ethnic tensions, but there are some ethnicities within the Jewish people, right? I shouldn't say maybe ethnicity, but people who came from various backgrounds, from many different countries, practicing different habits, and so on and so on. And that has been a standing issue. People who felt discriminated against, people who felt that they were not treated fairly or actually mistreated, and so on and so on. Never ever did I sense it from my father, whether he felt it personally or not, never reflected on us. So I grew up never feeling discriminated against or being shortened of something or being mistreated in any way. And I think that is the best thing that he has done, both for me and my sister. We went and developed our own careers. We followed and pursued our heart's desire. Each and every one of us opted for quite unusual paths in life without feeling that something wrong has happened to us or we were wronged by anybody. That is something that I can definitely say has contributed in many ways to the way I pursued and I went through my life.
Thank you. I think that's a gift as a parent, the ultimate gift, perhaps. But it probably also reflects on you and your sister, possibly, the people that you are as well at the heart of that. I'd like to continue that sort of discussion with Matty, because it may have been, your father's attitude imbued you with confidence and so on. But if we're going to talk openly and honestly, there was discriminatory and condescending behavior at that time, I guess from the Ashkenazi elite establishment towards the Mizrahim, the Jews that came, I guess, from the Arab world. The kibbutz, we've got this image of egalitarianism, largely secular European culture, though, the new Jew being created and so on. And in your book, Matty, you put it in one sentence, it's page 169, you write, these citizens, meaning the Mizrahi part of the population, have usually been regarded as a footnote to Israel's story. So my question is, how has your research and writing of this book informed your own understanding of the Mizrahi world back then? But also, how do you see sort of Israel today in this regard, where slowly, we could argue too slowly, depends how you see things, the lines are becoming blurred, okay? It's the generations come, those clear lines are really becoming more and more blurred. I mean, my view, now is the time of the new Jew, the new Israeli, as it all comes together. But, how do you think that through, Matty?
Well, like many people who are on this, who are with us at this discussion, I grew up with a very European idea of what Israel is. I grew up in Toronto, Canada. That's Canada being Australia's much less attractive cousin in the British Commonwealth. I grew up in Toronto with a very kind of standard Jewish idea of what Israel is, right? I knew a lot about Herzl and Vienna and pogroms in Europe and the kibbutz idea of socialism, and of course the Shoah loomed very large. And I knew about Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan and the kind of pantheon, the Ashkenazi pantheon of Israel's founding. which is very much the story of Israel's creation. And it's a wonderful story that I still love. It's a great story. But if you come to Israel and if you live here, I've been here for 25 years, and you have your eyes open, you have to admit at some point, better sooner than later, that those stories don't actually understand, they don't actually explain the country, the actual country. There's a real gap between the Israel of the imagination, as reflected in those stories, and the Israel of the street, of the market, of the, Tel Aviv and Rishon LeZion and Haifa, as they exist in reality. And there are several reasons for that dissonance, but one of the main reasons, in my opinion, is that if you look at Israel's Jewish population, only half of the people here came from Europe. Fully half of the Jews in Israel have roots in the Islamic world. They come from places like Aleppo, Baghdad, Casablanca, Tehran, Isfahan, places that never appeared in my map of what Judaism was growing up in a kind of Ashkenazi Jewish community abroad. And if you try to understand Israel without that part of the picture, you won't be able to understand it. In fact, I think that in 2021, that side of Israel's society is actually the one you need to understand in order to understand what Israel is. This is a Middle Eastern society. It's not just a society that happens to exist in the Middle East, but it's a society where most of the citizens are from the Middle East, going back many, many generations. And understanding that Jewish experience in Aleppo, in Baghdad, in Casablanca, that is crucial to understanding the Israeli mentality today, the way Israelis see the Middle East, the way they vote, the way they eat, the pop music they listen to, the way they behave, the kind of Judaism they practice. All of that has a lot more to do with the Judaism of the Middle East and North Africa than it does with the Judaism of Toronto or Warsaw. And if we want to understand Israel in the 21st century, I think we have to look a lot less at Warsaw and points west and a lot more at Aleppo, which is why I think that someone like Isaac Shoshan and his friends from this very small kind of marginal unit in 48, they actually have a lot more to teach us about the country now than Moshe Dayan. Because if you understand who these guys were, if you understand their complicated identities, and if you understand the way their Arabness, their kind of genuine connection to this part of the world, then you understand a lot about the state of Israel now, because of course, half of the Jews in Israel are the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people like Isaac Shoshan, otherwise known as Zaki Shasho, otherwise known as Abdul Karim Muhammad Ziki, people who had very complicated identity that was native to this part of the world and not foreign.
Thank you, Matty. I think, if you grew up in Toronto, a sort of mainly Ashkenazi background, you haven't been to Melbourne. We are Ashkenazi central, and I apologize to the few who aren't. So it's always when, those of us, depends on how old you are, when you went to visit Israel, who were your relatives? They were from the Warsaw and the Lodge and the Hungarians or the Jew. They were. So it wasn't until a bit later, as the generations, as this, what Jacob called ethnic differences, when people started marrying each other, that's the first time I think many of us, and I'm speaking for myself as a prime example, with the son-in-law, the daughter-in-law, and then obviously the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they come from other places. And all of a sudden you were meeting with, for whether it was the Chagim, the Jewish festivals, or just for a cup of tea, you were meeting people not from Europe. And someone's just right. Yeah, that's, I think it's really, really important to understanding Israel. And I guess for some of us who, spend a lot of time in Israel, Israel's become more exotic in a sense, as you begin, slow as it may be, to realize this is not so European and Western centric. It's a hell of a lot more interesting. Jacob, what's your sense when you talk about this identity of Israelis today? You've got your mute. Please unmute. Thanks.
A melting pot in the truest sense of the word. Actually, there is a reversal now. Believe it or not, some of the most dominant, most influential figures in public life now are the ones you would call Mizrahi. Whether it was exploited for a political purpose, we'll find out in the next few elections. But the fact is that they are heard, they are noticed, they are seen, they are present, and they stamp, they claim, they demand to have their time, their moment, in the sun. They want to have their stories told. And I think that story from, as you said, the condescending and the patronizing and the elitist feeling, I think is long gone. It's gone with the whole story with the kibbutzim. It's gone with the story of the famous generals and heroes in the army and whatever. So it's a totally different reality, to the point that if you approach today a 10 or 12 or even 18 years old, young people in Israel, so you say, where are your parents from? A generation ago, they would say they were Hungarian, they were Moroccan, they were Iraqi or Persians. Now they'll say, what do you mean? My parents were both born in Israel. Yeah, what did your parents, grandparents get? Oh, I think I had a grandparent from Tehran and another one from Bombay. But that's the reality now, you see? So I think that story has gone to be completely different now.
Thank you. There are so many more issues we could talk about today, including we could get further into the various operations that the men in the Arab section undertook, the successful ones, the failures, and the fact that what happened to those who were caught. Okay, we all know the story of Eli Cohen, but there's many other, the unknown stories which Matty starts to bring to light for us. They had their own personality issues between them, as Matty, writes about. I found fascinating the relationship that you described about, the relationship that is intentionally, or the intentional non-relationship with the Jews still living in those countries. This is prior to the mass emigration of Jews from these countries. They were in danger. And so that's a whole story. But they're lonely young men. And then there's a whole Jewish community like them, people like them, more or less, and they know they have to keep away because they're endangering. I mean, there's so many things here. There are so many specific stresses and strains. And one of them, which I don't know if it's a question, but I don't know, the word is the primitiveness of the conditions under which they had to operate is absolutely astounding. And I don't know if, Marty, you want to say something about that? We think the Mossad, and we think of, the most technologically advanced spy agency in the world. If you saw what these guys had, the lack of training, the few financial resources, they didn't even have a clear mission at the start. It's an amazing story of what they didn't have versus the image that in a very short period of time, the Mossad has built for itself.
That's also one thing that I loved about the story is that when I started to get them from Isaac, you have this idea of Israeli intelligence, some gleaming building in Tel Aviv with satellite dishes on the roof and, drones. And these guys did not own a camera. Israeli intelligence at the beginning of the Arab section does not own a camera. So when they wanted to take pictures of enemy positions on the Syrian border, they have to borrow a camera. There's one guy whose name we know, a civilian who owned a camera and who lent it to them. And two agents are dispatched to the Syrian border to take pictures. And they're told, if you don't come back, that's okay. But the camera better come back, because if we don't give this guy his camera back, he's going to be really angry. When they go to Lebanon, this is the beginning of Israeli intelligence. Isaac and a few of his friends are dispatched across the border into Lebanon. They don't have a radio. They have no way to communicate with headquarters. They are expected to kind of pack it on their own until communication can be established. And it takes a few months until the people in Israel can smuggle them a radio into Lebanon. So when the state of Israel is founded on May 14th, 1948, Isaac and his friends don't know. They have no idea that the state has been founded because they have no way to communicate with the people back home. And all they know is what's written in the Arab newspapers, which is that the Arab armies are victorious and that the Jewish enclave in Palestine is about to be eradicated. So they operate without salaries. They didn't make salaries until a very late stage of the game. So it's a seat of the pants operation. It's ad hoc. Of about a dozen spies in the Arab section at the beginning of the war, half of them get caught and killed, in part because they were amateurs. They didn't really know what they were doing, and they had very little, sophisticated equipment, and that gradually changes as time passes from the founding of the state. But they're operating very much by their wits. That's all they had: wits and bravery.
Bravery is the word. We're going to finish in a moment and take questions, but Jacob, would you like to comment about that, or, comment things that your father said about, they were flying by the seat of their pants, really?
He might not have said it, but I would often think, my goodness, what kind of irresponsible practice was it on behalf of the people who sent them under those circumstances? Would have never passed today, never. They didn't really have any backup. And as Matti mentioned, no resources. The only resources was their own resourcefulness in a special way, how to make do with what was available and what was not available. So yes, it was a different time, and he never ever complained about it. If he would comment on it, he would say it with a smile. He smiled a lot. He was a very positive person. And he would say, I cannot believe they did it. I cannot believe they sent us the way they did. But no question, it was a different world. And I think it was their determination, their absolute and total motivation and dedication to the cause, to the story of statehood, of the Jewish people, and so on. Sometimes when I say it, it looks like, oh, what are you talking about? This sounds so pompous, so out. But for them, it was reality. That's how they lived, and for him, that's how he continued on living also into later life. I would come and say, or my sister, who was even closer to him, she moved to live right next to where he was, and she saw him very, very often. And we would complain and kvetch with the politicians, with the situation. And we say, look where we are. Look at all the wonderful things we enjoy. Look out the window. Look at the high-rise building. Look at all the cars in the street. Look at the appliances we have at home. Where were we 70 years ago? And where are we now? So he continued thinking in that positive way. And I think it's a continuation of exactly the way he felt and acted in those years.
Thank you, Jacob, so much. And I think that's an appropriate place for us to stop. Thank you very much. Rolene Lamb will do an official, I guess, proper thank you, but really it's been my pleasure. I'm going to turn over to Joey Wilkinson from Zionism Victoria, who's going to field the questions. Okay, thank you.
Everyone, we've got a few questions. I'm just going to leave Matty and Jacob on the screen. So Jacob, there's a few questions for you here. The first one is, in his last years, did your father ever open up to you more about his past as a spy?
No, he didn't. No, he didn't.
We've also got another one, which is, can you tell us a bit more about being a guide for March of the Living? How did you get involved, and how did that go?
That's a little difficult to answer in 2 sentences. But growing up in Israel, surrounded by so many survivors, of course, it was something we were very much affected with. Yom HaShoah in Israel is a big thing for everybody. And I like to travel and I like to explore, and I'm fascinated with everything Jewish. And it was only natural that I would explore sites of Holocaust, as well as sites as Jewish history, whether it's in Spain or in Egypt or other countries. And at one point, it became for me almost like a calling, something that was very, very important for me, not just in Jewish education, but Holocaust education. So I found myself traveling a few times a year, not only and leading missions and groups, not only to Poland, but also to the Baltic states and Ukraine and all over Europe, of course. And that's something that's still very important for me. And it was just this week that I put the biggest smile on my face when I realized that March of the Living is hoping to resume operation for 2022. They already are working on it. So that was something very special because we missed it for 2 years. So hopefully next year it will take place.
Yeah, definitely incredible news. Matty, we've got 2 questions for you. What did you find trickiest about writing this book, and how did the process compare to writing your 2 previous books? We've also got a question, I guess, about what your 2 previous books are about.
Sure. The tricky part with this one was understanding what the story is. So if you have if you're trying to write something about the 6-Day War or about the Entebbe raid, it's clear what the story is. It's much easier to put your finger on the kind of main narrative line. And here, what I had initially was many different stories, little kind of anecdotes from the 48 war, none of them central to the outcome of the war, and some of them inconclusive in themselves, an attempt to assassinate an Arab leader in Haifa, for example, that kind of works and kind of doesn't work, an attempt to sink Hitler's yacht. With inconclusive results, it's an anecdote, a kind of a strange story that I tell in the book about how Hitler's yacht shows up in Beirut and Isaac and his friends try to sink it. It took me several years to amass enough material and to let it sink into my mind until I kind of understood what the storyline was and how it fit in with the broader picture of the war and how it fit in with the broader story that I'm trying to tell about Israel. And that's one of the reasons that it took me so long to write this book. Again, I interviewed Isaac initially in 2011. This book came out in 2019. So it took a while for me to kind of put it all together. It's a short book, it's not a long book. So what took time was not amassing reams and reams and reams of material. It was understanding what the story was. Just briefly, my two previous books are Pumpkin Flowers, which is a story about my own time in the Israeli military in a small guerrilla war in South Lebanon in the 1990s. And the first book I wrote is the Aleppo Codex, which is about the most important copy of the Bible, which is also called the Aleppo Codex. It's a manuscript that has a very interesting and a very dirty story. So it's a journalistic investigation into the fate of an ancient Bible.
Very cool. We've got another question for you, Matty. How was this book received in Israel?
I was very interested to see, I wrote it, I live in Hebrew and I write in English, and the books that I write are translated into Hebrew. And I have this interesting experience of seeing these books published more or less simultaneously in English and Hebrew, and then gauging the different reactions. The way people responded to it in Israel was completely different than the way people read it abroad. For most people abroad, this was the first they'd ever heard, not just of the Arab section, but of the whole Mizrahi side of Israeli society. Many people, even people who identify with Israel, who visited here, are just not aware of how important that aspect of our society is. That's not true of Israelis, of course. For Israelis, the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide, that fault line is very, very important. And Israelis argue about it and fight about it in different ways. It comes out in different ways in our politics, mostly in unhelpful ways in our politics and in our culture. And it's something that we're constantly processing in Israel. And the book kind of was part of a debate that's ongoing for Israelis. What is the role in this country of Jews who came from the Arab world? Has that role traditionally been underappreciated? Have these people been marginalized? Why don't we know these stories? So for Israelis, it was more of a going debate, while for people outside, I think it was a first exposure to something that they had never heard of.
Very interesting. We might finish with one more question for you, Jacob. What is a story that you heard about your father that you find particularly, a particular highlight that you can maybe share with the group?
Later in his career, my father initiated an operation to help bring people from Syria by way of Lebanon to Israel. He befriended a local clergy person who had connections in Beirut, and they would arrange for young people, mostly young people, to arrive from Aleppo, a few hundred miles away, to Lebanon, be taken on boats, a private boat that would reach the open seas, and an Israeli Navy boat will come and collect them and bring them to Israel. Actually, originally the operation had another name, but because of the success, and it was my father's initiative, it was called Operation Shoshan. That's how it's written down in history and in the publications. On one occasion, they met with these boats that brought the people on the Lebanese boat. They met them at sea, the Israeli Navy is there, and one of the heads of the Israeli top secret organizations wanted to see how it operates, and he was with them on the boat. And there was a young girl with three of her smaller young brothers. They were really small children. And she saw these people with uniform, and she was not sure what to make of it, because they could have been either Syrian or Lebanese officers or policemen, and she refused to leave the boat and come onto the Israeli Navy boat. And my father intuitively, and I think that's one of the most remarkable things, and he all of a sudden said, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, at which point she opened up and she shone and she brought her brothers and they came on board. That chief security officer, somebody who had some of the most incredible operations, said that he didn't tear in his life, but that was the moment he teared. And whenever he told it, there was never a dry eye in the house. And I think in many ways it typifies, again, the resourcefulness, the ability to respond and understanding people, which had to be a necessity in order to carry what he did.
Absolutely. I think that'll be a great place to finish it. I'm going to thank you both for taking the time, and I'm going to pass on to Rolene Lamb to do our conclusion. Well, Rolene, I think you're on mute, just very quickly.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us here tonight for a very special Lamb Jewish Library of Australia event. Jacob and Matty, thank you both so much for meeting our Australian time frame, being so warmly articulate, giving of your expertise, your time, and being able to provide us with an extraordinary insight into a fascinating time and remarkable people in Jewish history. And also providing us a deeper understanding of your wonderful book, Matty. Francis, thank you for being such an insightful moderator and bringing your positive energy to the event. Ilana, we sincerely appreciate your meticulous planning and arranging in relation to tonight and in bringing an idea to reality. Thank you. Lauren, Joey, and the staff of LJLA, we thank you all so much for your efforts for this event. And finally, a big thank you to our LJLA audience for joining us all here tonight. Next Sunday afternoon, the 14th of March, there is a giant book sale and carnival at the library and a range of great children's events. Please come along for those in Melbourne and enjoy and support us. We're excited that the library is now open for borrowing, browsing, researching after so many months of closure. We look forward to seeing many of you again in person. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers, Matty, Jacob, Francis. We really appreciate your time and your being with us tonight. It's been very, very special indeed. Thank you all. Good night.